We now see a new racism being preached. It's extraordinary to me to see this come back in my lifetime. An anti-white racism this time, as well as anti-Israel, is anti-Jewish. Anti-white racism, or the official title, critical race theory. Now, I've given you many examples over the last few years. Coca-Cola recently, for instance, teaching staff to be less white, which apparently means be less oppressive and aggressive. Now, giant defence contractor Raytheon telling white staff to find a white space to talk about their white biases and microaggressions. And I've also told you of some schools in the US teaching children to likewise split into affinity groups, depending on their race. Oh, and then there's the school in Melbourne that had boys stand up to shame them for being white and Christian and therefore horribly privileged males. Now, I won't go through all the examples again, there are just so many of them. But there is some good news here. Parents here, and especially in the United States, are now fighting back against this new racism. Both white parents and black. For instance, here is one of the latest examples of many.
The problem with bringing it to high school and grade school level is that we don't have the educators to properly teach these kids. Instead, they're using it as their own agenda to indoctrinate the kids to hate each other. And whether you believe that to be true or not, the reality is that's what's happening. Critical race theory is teaching that white people are bad. That's not true. That would teach my daughter that her mother is evil. You already have an educator within your staff that has pulled my daughter aside and said, well, you're a minority, so you know better than to engage in certain things.
Wow.
Whoa.
When I was brought to the school's attention, nothing happened to the educator. Instead, my daughter was brought in, and she was ridiculed. So my question is now, with critical race theory being brought in, what is your criteria to educate the educators? And who are you to educate my children, or any of our children, in life issues? That's our job.
Yes.
Your job is to teach them math and science. Our job is to teach them about life. I believe racial issues and tensions across the U.S. are nowhere near what they used to be decades ago. Do we have a long way to go? Sure. Do we still have individuals out there that need to be taught? Absolutely. But I believe the people here don't look at me as a black man. They look at me as a man standing in front of you addressing the issue that we all are very passionate about.
That's right.
Is that man our better future? Or the sort of race baiters that dominate so much of the airwaves these days? So impressive. I spoke a short while ago to John Hinderaker. He's a friend of this show and president of the Centre of the American Experiment, as well as a most excellent blogger on the Powerline blog. John has just finished a speaking tour in Minnesota to fight this critical race theory, and I asked him whether the reaction to the video that I've just shown you is similar to what he's found on his 17-city tour.
It is, Andrew. When people understand what critical race theory is, they hate it. I mean, it's very unpopular. And the fundamental reason why it's unpopular is because really CRT is just old-fashioned racism. It teaches that the most important thing about a person is the color of his skin. It teaches that you don't have rights as an individual, you have rights as a member of a group. And people with similar skin color have got the same personality and character traits. I mean, it's unbelievable. I'll just give you an example from my home state of Minnesota, Andrew. In a 6th grade class, the teacher divided the students, these are 12-year-olds, okay, divided them up by skin color and explained that some of them are oppressors and others are victims based solely on the color of their skin. And it's this kind of divisiveness and really incitement to race hatred that when people understand it, they really don't like it.
Are you seeing any difference in the reaction in the people that you've been addressing, a lot of parents obviously, between black parents and white parents, how they regard this kind of teaching?
Not really, Andrew. You know, it's interesting. On our tour, there have been two main presenters. One of them is Katrin Wigfall, who's a policy fellow in my organization, and the second is Kendall Qualls, who's an African American man who's very eloquent in denouncing critical race theory and the anti-Americanism that is really an important part of it. So no, I think when people understand what it really is, it doesn't break down by race. People just don't like it.
The people that I hear from when I present, you know, this has been going on for a couple of years, obviously, in a serious way. They're appalled by it. The people I talk to, the audience I'm talking to. I just wonder how something so obviously racist and so unpopular with so many parents actually gets to the point where it's taught by big corporations. We've seen Coca-Cola, now Raytheon, big corporations, and is now getting into schools. How does it get that kind of toehold when it's so obviously so racist?
Well, I can explain the schools somewhat, Andrew, although I confess I'm mystified by it as well. But a big part of the answer in the schools, the public schools, is the teachers' unions. The teachers' unions are unbelievably left-wing, and they control most of America's public schools. And they're the ones that have really driven the introduction of CRT into curricula all across the United States. And partly how they do it is they control school board elections. School board elections tend to have very, very little turnout, and it's pretty easy for the unions to actually get elected the school board members that they want. So that's a big part of how it's gotten into the schools. But why it's in Coca-Cola, Major League Baseball, Delta Airlines, I find that very hard to understand.
All right, well, let me put one proposition to you that the advocates would say. What they're doing, they say, on the most benign reading, is that they're teaching white kids in particular, you've got an advantage from your race, you're not looking at it, you know, because you're sort of in the bubble, but you've got advantages that kids of other skin colours or whatever may not have. What's wrong with telling them to have a look at that and examine their assumptions?
Well, if that were all this were about, it wouldn't be so bad, but it's not. Critical race theory is basically neo-Marxism, and it opposes Enlightenment rationality. It denounces neutral legal principles. It openly advocates racial discrimination in various ways. So you know, they'll always try to pretend, oh, no, we just want to teach about slavery, for example. Well, I graduated from high school in 1967, and I learned all about slavery. You know, nobody is objecting to teaching those facts about the history of our country, but that's not what this battle is about.
Just finally, John Hinderaker, we now see schools in the US, and we've also seen now one in Scotland, say that schools should not be teaching To Kill a Mockingbird because it's a racist book in the sense that here is the white savior, and that puts obviously, you know, African Americans at a point of, you know, blessed man, you save us, puts them in an inferior position to him. Is that how you read To Kill a Mockingbird?
It's not how I read it, Andrew. I mean, I think it takes a certain kind of perversity to take a work of literature like that and reframe it in those kinds of political terms. And that happens to be a great book. And it's a really sad thing if we are taking great literature, whether it's Shakespeare or To Kill a Mockingbird or Mark Twain or whatever, out of the hands of our young people, because what substitutes for that is invariably literature of a much, much lower quality.
And I think also literature that tends to pit people against each other instead of uniting it against the in a common cause. John Hinderaker, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Andrew. Happy to be with you.